the demand for quality is extraordinarily high. There's very, very little patience or, there's acceptability for any deviation from specification. We tend to look at results. Does it work or does it not? Whereas, the Japanese are very, very quality conscious. And I think rightly so, frankly.
こんにちは皆さん。ビジネスサクセスジャパンのポッドキャストへようこそ。Hello everyone and welcome to the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your host, Lydia Buchelman. This podcast is for individuals who want to develop and strengthen the communication skills and mindsets that are essential for a Japanese business environment. The helpful, practical suggestions and engaging insights offered here provide listeners with the in-depth cultural context needed to achieve their own version of success while collaborating with Japanese counterparts. In today's episode, I'm sharing a conversation with Kevin Crowell. Currently, he is president of Asia Pacific Group, a company that he started nearly 30 years ago, and is the Chief Cross-Cultural Outreach Officer of the organization Pacific Tango Group. Kevin has decades of experience working in Japan and with Japanese people and companies, so be sure to listen in to learn more about his background and what he's learned from his wide-ranging experiences with Japan. But before we get into the episode, let's go over some Japanese. In the previous episode, we learned the word monozukuri. Mo-no-zu-ku-ri. Monozukuri. Monozukuri is essentially just the Japanese translation of the word manufacturing or craftsmanship. But be sure to listen to the previous episode with Francis Pacheco to learn more about this term and its significance in Japanese business culture. This week, I want to teach a word that comes up towards the end of today's conversation. Shumi. 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 The most common translation of shumi into English is probably the word hobby. However, people who visit Japan are commonly impressed by how seriously many people in the country take these hobbies. Rather than just being a way to blow off steam after work, Japanese people will often devote quite a bit of time, money, and energy on going deep into their chosen shumi. Be sure to listen to the end of today's conversation to hear what Kevin has to say about the topic. And I also just have one more note before we officially get into today's interview. If you're enjoying the podcast and want to keep the content flowing, please consider doing one of three things. If you haven't already, please go ahead and follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're using, and consider leaving a review as well. This helps the podcast reach new listeners who could benefit from the information shared here. If you have a favorite episode, please go ahead and share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it. And if you would like to help make sure that I stay well caffeinated enough to keep putting together these episodes, please consider offering financial support at the podcast's new Ko-fi page. You can find the link to do so in the description of the episode. So thank you so much in advance, and let's get into today's conversation.
My name is Kevin Crowell, and I am with a couple of different companies, Pacific Tango Group, which is a consortium of service providers who work within the Asian market space. I also have my own company, which is called Asia Business Group, a company that I've held since 1992. And then I also have been dabbling in real estate as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you're pretty good about keeping busy, to say the least.
I do like being busy.
So could you share a little bit more about your history with Japan specifically?
Sure. So I hope I'm not going to bore you to death, but well, let me kind of start at the beginning. So I'm originally from Connecticut. I am truly a Connecticut Yankee. My family goes back into the 1700s in Connecticut. And for some reason in my family, we've always had a love of learning foreign languages and cross-cultural contact. My grandfather was orphaned at a young age, and he was raised by his grandparents. My great-grandfather, actually that would be my great-great-grandfather, was actually a minister with Dwight Moody for a while of Moody Bible College. And he was stationed in Florence, Italy. And from Florence, he would travel through Northern Africa preaching. And when my grandfather was orphaned, he was raised by his grandparents and went over to live in Florence, where he became fluent in Italian. And during both World Wars, he acted as a interpreter, translator. And my father was very impressed by this. During the Korean War, rather than be drafted, he enlisted into the Air Force, who promptly sent him to language school to learn Russian. So my dad learned Russian and was then stationed in Germany, where he monitored Russian broadcasts. He picked up German and became fluent in German, and has had a lifelong love of German culture. He lived in Germany for several years during the war, and then went back as an adult and lived, I think, 10 or 15 years in Germany as well. And so I kind of grew up with this in my DNA. The small Connecticut town I grew up in was not very diverse. I really enjoyed that cross-cultural aspect of things. And as a high school student in this little sort of lily white town, for some reason, we had area studies classes. And I started by taking an African studies class, then a Latin American studies class, then an Asian studies class, and was just thrilled at being able to learn about different cultures and different peoples. And from there, when I went to college, my first class Monday morning at 9 a.m. was Asian studies. I developed a particular interest in that and kind of kept going. At one point, I had to make a decision whether to study Chinese or Japanese. And thinking back on my dad and his studying Russian, which he never used professionally because Russia was pretty much closed to commerce and industry, I kind of thought, well, I'll study Japanese. And the love affair with the language and with the country just kind of took off from there. After I graduated, I went to live in Japan for about 3 years, first in a small rural area, living with a Japanese family, working in their juku, teaching English to small children and adults, and then moved to Kobe, where I was for 2 years, working primarily for Kobe Steel. Then when I came back, I started a MBA program, and then was hired by a Japanese company that I'd made contact with when I was living there, and started their US office, and from there went to Toshiba. So all told, I was working for Japanese subsidiaries for about 10 years, and then got the idea that, gee, if I could be helping Japanese businesses here enter into the US market, I ought to be able to do the opposite, helping American companies then go to Japan. So I started my own company, which was then called Japan Business Group, and then sort of really started working with American suppliers to the radio frequency market, essentially cellular telephony, to get them up and running in Japan, and have been doing that. And over the course of years, without getting into too much detail, now am working with more Japanese companies coming to the US. And that's been really great. It's allowed me to use my language skills, which admittedly are getting pretty rusty through COVID, but it has allowed me to really maintain that love of the language and the love of the Japanese culture.
Japanese language is definitely a use it or lose it sort of situation.
Yeah, so I read and write daily. The opportunities to speak are less frequent. So my spoken Japanese has gotten a little bit rusty, as I say. It doesn't take long for it to come back, and I should probably be doing more watching of Japanese TV and the like. But at this point in my career, it seems that when I need it, it does come back, and it always is that sort of struggle. But I just love speaking it and love being able to communicate. It allows me to communicate on a level with people that otherwise I may not be able to get to know in that way.
It's obviously something that goes away quickly. Like if I don't speak for a few days, I do feel like it starts to get rusty, but as you said, it does come back pretty quickly. So something to be aware of, but not stress about too much, probably, for people.
It's kind of amazing how your residual memory works. And I think it works the same in English as it does in Japanese. There are so many words that I have a residual memory of that I don't speak. If I hear them once, I'll say, "Oh yeah, I know that word," and I can start using it. And it's the same in Japanese.
So, would you mind sharing a little bit more about what most of your work is now specifically? You mentioned that a big part
Sure.
is now primarily focused on helping companies move into the US.
Right. So it's been kind of an interesting evolution. When I started my business back in the 90s in my area, I'm located in Chicago. The largest, most successful company was Motorola. Motorola had come out with this unique product, cellular telephone, and they were leading the world in cellular telephony. They had brought their supplier base along with them, worked with those suppliers to have them develop and produce parts that could be used at high frequencies, were miniaturized so that you could put them into a smaller phone, even though in the 90s, it's hardly what we'd call small today. But those suppliers had developed a unique technology. And a lot of them were just sort of mom and pop shops that had started with Motorola when Motorola was fairly small, when they were making radios and TVs. And they didn't have a whole lot of international savvy. So as Motorola was succeeding, Japanese handset manufacturers were trying to get into the market. They were locating production facilities over in the United States. But all of that design work was being done in Japan. And for an American company, particularly a small mom and pop shop, to try and really sell their products in Japan was difficult. They needed somebody who could negotiate both sides of that equation. So that's where I stepped in. And I did everything from soup to nuts. When I started, it was just a one-man operation. So we put together the business strategy. We got them ready to export. I went over to Japan and did the market research, figured out, who the main contacts and targets should be, and then actually did the sales work, set up lines of distribution, handled key accounts, everything. It was not ideal, but I found that it was difficult to find at that time a Japanese who would be able to work under those circumstances for a small fledgling American company. It took me 10 years to find somebody who could actually work with me over in Japan to help my clients on the ground there. Found a great guy, and he was able to essentially take over that Japan portion so that he'd be able to give real-time support to Japanese customer, and that made all the difference in the world. Fast forward now into the 2000s, China has really come onto the marketplace strong. It was really it was an inflection point for a lot of American companies. Do they spend time trying to open up the Japanese market, or do they sort of leapfrog over Japan, maybe go to Korea, or then ultimately the target being China? And that's exactly what a lot of companies started doing. They would forsake the Japanese market and go into either Korea or China. I became Asia Business Group from Japan Business Group, found partners in those countries, and started providing service to my clients over there. Although really never had a big organization in China because my value benefit wasn't as great. Most companies could find Chinese who were bilingual who would work for a lot less than I was willing to work for. But point being that the Japanese business that I had was dwindling. I went back to that model of working with Japanese coming inbound into the United States because particularly by about 2005 and certainly by 2010, a lot of Japanese companies were realizing that China was not the mother lode that they thought it was going to be. Doing business in China is difficult. There are all sorts of IP issues. And the Japanese brand in the United States has always remained strong. And I think they found that it was a lot more profitable, a lot more beneficial to continue selling to the American market. And so I was then started working with small to actually everyone from small to mid-sized companies on up to large Fortune 500s, helping them to improve their sales into the US market. And I still continue to do that. I have business actually on both sides of the equation, both inbound and outbound to the US. But I would say that at this point, it's tipped more inbound.
Yeah, there's probably a whole episode worth of content in discussing the difference between people's expectations about the opening Chinese market versus what's really ended up coming to pass in recent years. But just focusing on Japan specifically. Mm-hmm. So Japan is notorious for valuing strong long-term business relationships, but there's another practice in Japanese corporate culture where people are rotated to new positions every few years. And I was just curious what sort of impact you've seen that have on trying to cultivate those long-term business relationships.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. So I've seen it work both as an employee of a Japanese subsidiary and on the side of, say, someone who is providing service to those companies or working with American companies trying to sell into Japanese subsidiaries. It is not ideal, quite frankly. The rotation cycle typically lasts anywhere between 3 to 5 years. It's great for educating Japanese executives in how foreign markets work. At least that is the expectation. But what happens is that for a Japanese subsidiary, and having been an employee at a Japanese subsidiary, I found that it disrupted the whole leadership training cycle. So typically, any American that went into that subsidiary would really be capped in terms of how far they could advance. There was a very clear rice paper ceiling, as it were. It's been interesting in the last 15 years or so. You see more and more C-suite level Americans at subsidiaries. But my suspicion is, and I don't think I could really say for certain, but my suspicion is that a lot of those are more figureheads, and that the real decision making is being made by people, Japanese, behind that position. And the amount there's always been a disparity between responsibility and authority. So at subsidiaries, and that responsibility for whatever that particular role is may be very high, but the authority would rest primarily with the expat, and that's tough. So what I found in Japanese subsidiaries, and often is that these people would come in from Japan and then get to know the U.S. market just about the time where you had really kind of gotten them to a point where they understood the dynamics of the U.S. market. They went back and they were replaced by someone who was green. So there was that whole process of re-educating that person. It was inefficient, quite frankly. And that inefficiency, I think, ultimately costs them profitability. From the standpoint of a contractor to a Japanese company, it's pretty much the same trajectory. So just when you've gotten your Japanese interface, your counterpart, understanding what the market trends are, how business is done in the United States, that person is called back to Japan, and then a new person comes in. The new person ideally would be great if they were in an international role before and they're used to that. And I've seen that happen. It can be, I think you're getting a level of Japanese managers who are much more globalized, much more internationalized than they were before. So when that person comes from another assignment, say from Southeast Asia or China or wherever, and they come in, they're much more able to immediately get up to speed. But oftentimes what happens is that you get somebody who is being trained into that sort of international management role. And that's where it becomes, again, sort of a step back where that person has to, take a long time to be brought up to speed. So that's really, it's changing, and it's fluid, it's dynamic, but there's still work that needs to be done there. And I think over time that hopefully will right itself. From the standpoint of an American company trying to sell into a Japanese company, there's always, again, that tension of, who should I be talking to? Who is my target? Is my target the American in that company who has the responsibility for perhaps purchasing my product, or is it someone else? And that's something that it's incumbent upon the American company to suss out for themselves who's the real decision maker in that case.
It's interesting how it can be easy for non-Japanese people to look at that sort of system in Japan and just say, oh, that doesn't make any sense, it's inefficient. But as you said, it has an educational purpose. So in a Japanese context where the company really values people sticking around for a long time, ideally lifetime employment, and because of that, they want to cultivate generalists, that sort of system for education makes sense. But as you said, it can be extremely inefficient.
And I think really what happens is you have a clash of cultures in this sense. On the one hand, you have the Japanese who are expecting to create these generalists, and there's a ton of good reasons why that's a great model. And then you have on the American side specialists. Again, a lot of great reasons why that can be, a great model. The issue is when you bring those two together and the expectations are not met, then you have a very volatile situation. And I've seen this happen a lot in subsidiaries where someone is brought in to do a job, they're kind of stymied. There's this whole education component that the American doesn't understand, that it's going to take time for them to learn the organization. They may have a very specific skill set, which they've honed over years, working for previous companies. They go into a Japanese company, the Japanese company is thinking, yeah, great guy, he knows his stuff. We really want him to stick around. They try and make a generalist out of him, and boom, it kind of blows up. And typically what would happen in that situation, I've seen it happen a lot, is that the American employee leaves, and there's a lot of hard feelings on both sides. And probably the biggest fallout of all of this is that enduring lack of trust. And I think that it's hard for a Japanese employer to feel that they can trust an American employee if they believe that that person is going to leave for another position, possibly at a competitor. So, it's trying to get those expectations correct from the outset. That's really important.
Yeah, especially cross-culturally, managing expectations becomes one of the most important things.
It is.
Moving on a little bit to Japanese consumers.
Sure.
You wrote on your LinkedIn profile that Japanese consumers make up pretty much the most demanding market. And what did you mean by that?
The demand for quality is extraordinarily high in a B2B transaction. One business selling to another, there's very, very little patience or there's acceptability for any deviation from specification. If you're selling electronic components, that tolerance on the main product has to be exactly within spec. But then there are also minor things like cosmetics. Say if you're producing capacitors, if the capacitors look a little bit off, yet are fully functional and operating within specification, they may be rejected. And that's something that's very hard for an American company to understand. We tend to look at results. Does it work or does it not? Whereas, the Japanese are very, very quality conscious. And I think rightly so, frankly, to demand that a product be produced in the exact way and manner in which it is specified at, including some of the cosmetic issues as well. So from the B2B side, there's a huge demand and really desire for quality. On the business to consumer side, it's equally as high. So I think, well, probably one of the best examples I can give is when my wife and I were living in Japan. She bought a woolen overcoat, and now more than 40 years past, she still has that thing, and it looks as amazing as it did when she bought it. It's so well tailored. It's just, and the fabric hasn't pilled, and it's just a really nice, high quality garment. It was expensive. It was really expensive, but we've had it for 40 years, and that's something that I think Americans have a very, very different concept of. We want something that's has an acceptably high quality, but is acceptably inexpensive. I mean, we don't want to buy cheap usually, but the quality can be good enough. And that's not something that I see in Japan, either on the business to consumer side or business to business side. And that is also something that's really difficult for Japanese companies to understand when they come into the United States, because they'll, let's focus on the business to business side. If they have a product which lasts longer, has cost efficiencies in the way that perhaps it can be integrated into the end user's production, and is a little bit more expensive, American companies just don't want it for a couple of reasons. One is there may be a life cycle mismatch. I was once talking to a client. They made tractor trailers, the trailer part of a tractor trailer. And my client had a type of steel, it was a coated steel product, that would last 20 times longer in salt spray testing than regular steel. In other words, it's highly anti-corrosive. And it was a little bit more expensive to use, but 20 times the life. I mean, you could have that trailer now for probably ad infinitum, as long as the wheels don't give out. And the American engineer that I was speaking with said, well, the average life of a trailer is 7 years. That's all anybody wants it for. And then they sell it. Why would we need your product? It just doesn't make any sense. Well, he was right. I mean, if the expected life of this product was only 7 years, who's going to care if it lasts 21, whatever, 42 years, because no one's going to want it anyways. So there's that mismatch. And I think it's very difficult for Japanese marketers to get that concept of, sometimes it's just good enough. I'm not saying that they should understand that, but certainly they need to understand that sometimes, when they're looking at what niches they want to fill, that sometimes they have to factor in that whole quality piece as well.
Yeah, that's very fascinating, because it kind of ties into what you were saying before about trying to cultivate generalists versus trying to cultivate specialists. At risk of just falling straight into stereotypes, this is just as kind of a reference for people to think about things in a more general way. So in Japan, obviously the stereotype surrounding business culture is Kaizen, gradual improvement, obsessing over making things better over time. Whereas obviously the stereotype in the US is fail fast, innovate, disrupt. So in reality, most of the time it's somewhere in the middle. And on top of that, the ideal completely depends on the context. So
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up, because, what I find most satisfying and most appealing about what I do is the opportunity to continually break down stereotypes. As humans, I think we naturally categorize things. That's how we learn. We take information, we put it into a group, we store it, and then we compare based off those groupings that we put in our head. And I'm going to be the first to admit that I stereotype. It's sort of a natural thing. And what I love about what I do is that every time I think I understand the Japanese, I meet with someone, I speak with them, and my entire world is blown apart because they don't fit into that category. That stereotype just gets blown to pieces. And I think that happens in when I speak to Americans as well, but it's a little different because I'm speaking in a second language. I'm listening harder. I'm my whole interest in cross-cultural communications and cross-cultural contact, it has primed me for that moment. And I just love it when I that whole construct that I've built up in my head is completely blown apart. It gives me such great faith in humanity. I often say this, and I'm wondering if you would agree. The most strongly individual people I know in the world are Japanese. Whereas the stereotype is that, here we are, Americans, we have this rugged individualism, and, we're all cowboys out on the range lassoing our steer. But I tell you, the Japanese that I know so many Japanese who are so strongly and committedly individualists that it's mind-blowing. We think of them as being this monolithic culture and everyone following in lockstep. And that's about as far from true as I can imagine. Mm-hmm. Do you find that the same?
Well, yeah. It's not something that I could call myself much of an expert in, but I wonder if it has to do with cultural expectations. Like if you're a rugged individualist in the US, it's like, okay, join the club. Whereas in Japan, if you kind of crave cultivating your own identity, you have to go at it with 100% of who you are, because the expectations are just a little bit different in terms of how society sees you and how society expects you to behave. But again, looking at culture, it's all just a tool. So anytime you talk about culture, you're just coming up with ideas that are tools, but you don't use those tools on individuals. Individuals are still individuals. You just use those tools to help you understand an individual's behavior, not to kind of put them together and say, okay, you're Japanese, therefore you are all of these things.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah.
Just moving on a little bit. So we already talked about the standards of Japanese consumers, but are there any things that foreign companies can do specifically to help actually gain traction in the Japanese market? That seems to be a real pain point for people trying to move in.
Yeah. So I think if you look back at what has been successful in Japan on a consumer level, branding, highly branded lifestyle products, and look at how incredibly well Apple has done in Japan. Apple is not just a product. It's a brand. It's a lifestyle. It's a choice. Back in the early 90s, when it was very difficult for cellular handset manufacturers to enter into the Japanese market, including, well, at that time, Apple didn't have a product, but, including Motorola, the big guys, I never would have thought that Apple would have the market share that it has today. But it makes a whole lot of sense because they really relied on that culture and the brand that they created around that culture. And admittedly, a lot of which, came from Japan. Steve Jobs was a huge fan of Japanese quality and design. So it's not, it shouldn't have been unthinkable, but at the time, it seemed that the way the technology was moving and the way the Japanese had constructed their bandwidth requirements for cellular, that it was that everyone was going to get shut out except the 14 Japanese handset manufacturers. But that gradually changed, and now we have it was funny. I was in Tokyo a couple of years ago, and I was sitting on the train and trying to count how many people I saw on the train on Apple phones, and it was by far over 50%, a lot. So branding. I think luxury items have always sold very well. And back to lifestyle, I think, this whole concept of, the sort of freewheeling, easygoing American culture still sells in Japan. Blue jeans, oh my gosh. I don't know if you're aware of this, but vintage blue jeans are actually a thing in Japan. T-shirts, the vintage T-shirts, on and on and on. So there are opportunities out there, but you have to know your niche. It's like anything else.
It's interesting how there was kind of a natural culture fit, at least in terms of Apple. So definitely something that other companies can think about in terms of their targets in Japan, their target consumers in Japan.
Yeah, on the B2B side, it really is all about niche marketing. What is it that you have that your Japanese competitors don't? And it's not always a product differentiation. The best is having some sort of patented technology that differentiates you from everyone else on the block. That's hands down the best. Short of that, though, one of the things that large Japanese say, my area of expertise is primarily in the electronic components. So a lot of Japanese component manufacturers are loath to supply small to mid-sized Japanese companies. They don't want small orders. They want large, repeatable orders only. So these small to mid-sized companies really get the short end of the stick. An American company that goes in and is willing to sell in smaller lots at reasonable prices, and mind you, at smaller lots, you're going to be able to get a better profit. It is disruptive because the TDKs, the Muratas of the world, they don't want to deal with that. They're perfectly happy just to walk away from that business.
It's very interesting. Definitely something to look into in terms of a way into Japan instead of just trying to target these large companies. There's an underserved, medium to small sized population in Japan. That's great to hear. Well, not for them, but in terms of people looking for opportunities. So you mentioned to me in our previous conversation that your mentors at Kobe Steel in the past had a huge impact on you while you were working in Japan. Could you tell us a little bit about what mentorship tends to look like in Japan?
Yeah, so mentorship in Japan is, I should say, less specific in terms of teaching you a skill. It's less technical and more temperamental. That it goes back to what you were saying about raising generalists. So my mentors in Japan were less concerned about me learning specific routines or specific knowledge. That would come, but more important was to be able to learn how to approach learning in a way that would open that information up to me. So to learn patience, to learn persistence, that was huge. When I went to Japan, I was in my early 20s, and I was neither patient nor persistent. And it was a revelation to me to really dig in deep to that. We talked about individualism, and in a sense, perhaps this is a self-selecting market, as it were, in that the mentors that I have had in Japan and have all been these sort of rugged individualists, people who had bucked the system for one reason or another. And perhaps they took a shine to me because I wasn't Japanese, because I was outside of that system. And it was safe for them to show their true selves to me in a way that they couldn't with their Japanese colleagues. And that enabled me to, I think, really get to know a subset of Japanese who I might certainly would not have otherwise known, and to get the benefit of their knowledge and expertise, wisdom. So let me give you a couple of examples. When I told you I lived in a small country town, small by Japanese standards, about 100,000. And I lived with a family and worked in their juku. Incredibly interesting family. The wife was the illegitimate child of a Buddhist monk who was very high in the order. He had gotten so high that he was allowed to have a child, essentially. She grew up in a monastery. She married a man who was a communist, a Japanese communist, and who was active in trying to organize the Toyota plant in the late 50s, early 60s, which ultimately failed. He was blacklisted. He was very intelligent and very, very good in math. They ended up opening up this juku, this cram school. And they essentially had nowhere else to go. They had to do this just to survive. So they bring me in to teach English to these young kids and also some adults. And I just, I was able to learn a lot about, a different side of Japan than I think most people knew about. My mentor at Kobe Steel was a gentleman who just a very expansive thinker. He just, we had a lot of shared interests. We bonded. I like collecting antiques, and we'd go out on antique hunting exercises. Occasionally he'd show up at my door with something that he found. He said, "I want you to have this." And it was he teaching me about how to do my job there? No, but he was teaching me incredible life lessons on generosity, how to listen to people, how to really succeed in a cross-cultural environment. And I just absolutely treasure that time with him. And I've had others throughout my career. Those are two that just really have stuck with me.
It's interesting to hear how there's a focus on helping people become the type of person who can succeed rather than learning skills, developing their resume, things like that we would probably normally associate with mentorship in the United States.
Yeah. Mind you, I wouldn't have minded that. I think I made a lot of
No, there's nothing wrong with skills.
but I think that's just the difference between how it's approached in Japan and how it's approached in the United States. And I would assume that some hybrid of that would be ideal, but I wouldn't change anything. It was pretty valuable stuff.
So kind of going back to some of the work that you do and some insights you may have gained from the work that you do, what do you think the difference is between companies just trying to quote unquote Americanize themselves to find success in the US, or American companies vice versa trying to quote unquote Japanize themselves in order to find success? What's the difference between that and working to genuinely cultivate a mutual understanding to find success?
Yeah. So I'm going to backtrack just a little bit before I answer that, and just say that one of the things that I always get a kick out of is when somebody meets me for the first time and they understand my connection with Japan, they immediately give me their card, and they do it in the Japanese fashion. They hold it with both their thumbs and they bow slightly, and they've obviously taken some sort of cross-cultural class or watched a YouTube on how to exchange business cards in Japan. And what gives me a kick out of that is that, okay, that's fine. that works. But that's the surface level. I don't know of any Japanese who has gotten really offended by an American, passing their business card over with one hand or writing on their business card later. People understand that kind of stuff. They're expecting there to be differences in cultures. I think by focusing too much on the mechanics, you lose sight of the big picture. And now I will transition into what you asked me. So how do you approach this cross-cultural chasm? I think of it as in 3 steps. I think it's, one step is, just adopting, that sort of other cultures' ways, becoming more Japanized, becoming more Americanized. So I sort of think of it as, that's like being invited to a dance, right? You're inviting someone to an event. Then there is that point where you try and foster mutual appreciation and mutual understanding. And that's when you ask that person to dance. You're not just inviting them to the dance, you're asking them to actively participate in that dance. Dance with me, right? I take it a step further. And that final step involves essentially full immersion and free will, where, to use this dance analogy, it's now I'm going to ask this person out on a date. And I'm going to take that person and we're going to have an evening dancing together. Will you come with me? Would you like to participate in this event as a couple, essentially? So the analogy may be flawed somewhat, but I think what I'm trying to get at here is that full immersion is perhaps the best way to start breaking down some of these cultural divides. And that's something that I think is sorely missed on both sides of the Pacific. It's difficult for Americans going to Japan to fully integrate into Japanese society. A lot for their own reasons. They don't learn the language. They don't participate in activities that Japanese are coordinating or promoting. It's, we hold ourselves back. And I think that's true on this side for Japanese coming to the United States as well. That Japanese social hierarchy follows them when they are expats here. They end up spending a lot of time with other expats. They never meet Americans and interact on a very meaningful way. And what I really think is, and this became a bad word at some point, and I'm not sure why, but I think you need to go native. Back in the 50s and 60s, if you read back through some of the novels and things that were written at that time, they disparaged someone because they went native. They totally adopted the other culture. I'm not so sure that's a bad thing. And certainly having the linguistic skills makes that a lot easier, but that's not even really what's all that's required. I mean, what's really required is an act of free will, where you say, you know what, I am going to very deliberately become a part of this culture and make this culture a part of who I am. And I think it's really only in that way that we can become successful in going back and forth between these two cultures. Does that mean you abandon your culture? No, it doesn't. But I think, we're fairly complex thinkers as humans, and we can keep these dualities in our minds. And I think, to me, that's really what is at stake here. We need to be able to fluidly cross between those cultures and do it in a very meaningful and deliberate way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another useful way to think about it might be relationships. So that you can live in such a way where the relationships you have with people has no impact on you as a person. You don't change based on the relationships. You kind of keep people at a distance, keep some formality. Or if you more sincerely enter into a relationship with someone, you are changed by it. You change the other person, you are changed by it in the future. No matter what happens, you're just not the same person. So that could be a useful way to think about it as well.
I agree. I agree.
So, how does that idea kind of align with the work that you do as a Chief Cultural Outreach Officer, just one of your many titles?
Right. Well, so that's my title at Pacific Tango Group, Chief Cultural Outreach Officer, and we're just forming. And part of let me digress a little bit and say that Pacific Tango Group is a consortium of business service providers to Asian subsidiaries in the United States. We're located in Chicago, and when we set up Pacific Tango Group, we very consciously set up a pacifictangogroup.org organization where we wanted to try and affect this disparity between cultures. And ultimately, what we'd like to do is to start seeing more cross-cultural events, hosting cross-cultural events, providing an outlet where Asians from anywhere can come and really speak meaningfully, start to create relationships, even just through simple things like a bowling night or getting together at a restaurant to exchange ideas and share a meal. Something very, very simple, but something which eludes that sort of expat experience very often. Mm-hmm. So that's what, it's really just trying to create more opportunities for people to get together and to share thoughts through activities. Now, I really, when I lived in Japan, I loved doing that. I loved being able to, get together with a group of friends and just go out and do things together. And I hope that we can do that for expats living here in the Chicago area as well.
It'll be great to see how that goes going forward as well. So I'll definitely be including some links in the description of the episode as well for my listeners so that you can all learn more about that. But yeah, having those spaces where people can be encouraged to break out of their expat bubbles. There's expat bubbles with expats in Japan.
Oh, yeah.
Korea, I've experienced both of those, but the same thing can happen to expats who come to the States as well. So creating those safe spaces for people to be encouraged to reach out beyond those bubbles is very important. So just to kind of start wrapping things up for today, do you have any examples of a communication breakdown that you've experienced due to differences in culture?
I think I was thinking about this, and I think it mostly has to do with mismatched expectations. And from a work standpoint, it typically revolves around issues of time and duration. I know working in Japanese subsidiaries, there was always the question of, when can I go home? Do I have to stay here? I'm not doing anything productive, but my boss hasn't left yet, and I know what the expectations are. And from the other side, there's a frustration there, and from the other side, I think that really feeds into this idea of loyalty. Is this person going to work out for the subsidiary long term? They wonder. Those expectations need to be really worked on and fully vetted up front and understood. When I was working back in the 80s for Japanese companies, they always said, "Oh, we know that you have family expectations at home, so you can go." It's like, well, we're going to give you a pass on this. And that never felt really good. When I've spoken with Japanese women who are now entering the workforce in greater numbers because of lack of employees, they're given that same pass. Oh, we know that you have family considerations, so you can go early. And they're given a pass to leave early, but it's not something that is equal, and that is very disruptive to corporate culture. How do you develop leaders within a company when you have two tiers of employees, some who are given a break, some who are not? So those expectations need to be put to the light.
Just because it's a pass doesn't mean that it's a free pass.
No.
So if you were chatting with somebody who was going to Japan and they wanted to work in Japan or do business in Japan, but they really didn't have time to learn much about the country, its culture, its language, what would your recommendation be for them to learn before they go to Japan?
And there's a time crunch? That's a great question. I'm going to surprise myself when I say this. I'd say bring your hobby. What is it that you like to do that kind of defines you? And make sure that you have whatever that is with you when you go. So equipment. If you're a knitter, bring your knitting things and maybe some examples of what you've done. One of my favorite things about Japan is shumi, and how that means, for your listeners who may not know, it's hobby. All Japanese have hobbies, and a hobby is not. I mean, as Americans, we think of a hobby as something rather frivolous. In Japan, a hobby is an avocation, and it's very, very serious to them. When someone tells you that that their hobby is playing guitar, and you don't think that it's something light. They're probably pretty damn good, because they've been perfecting this thing forever. And if you go in and try and say, oh, let's get together and play some tunes, you're going to get blown away. Bring that same passion, that you have for something with you, and then start trying to make connections, because you will make connections through that. Make that a part of who you are, because then you're going to be able to meet people with the same interests that you have, and they will become your mentors.
I think that's great advice. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Just before we sign off, is there anything that we didn't really get to touch on that you wanted to share, or anything that we missed?
No, I think you did a great job.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation, and be sure to check out the links in the description of this episode to learn more about Kevin, Pacific Tango, and everything else that Kevin is up to related to Japan. If you enjoyed today's conversation, go ahead and share it with a friend, colleague, or connection on LinkedIn to help spread the perspectives and information shared in the podcast. And please remember to go ahead and subscribe or follow on whatever platform you are using, and also leave a rating and review if you enjoy the podcast. If you would like to support the podcast financially, please check out my link to the new coffee page to help keep me well caffeinated and making content. As always, feel free to email me at businesssuccessjapan@gmail.com if you have any other questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes or interview topics. Also, be sure to reach out if you would like to contribute as a guest on the podcast to share your own cultural insights into doing business in Japan. I'd love to hear from you directly, so if you would like, please leave me a voice message. You can find the link to do that in the description as well. But for now, remember that the more you learn, the more confident you will become as you explore all of the opportunities Japan has to offer you. Until next time, mata kondo.